China is tightening its grip on Taiwan with the kind of hug you'd get from a python. Slow, methodical, and suffocating. Their relationship has been fraught with tension and hostility. Despite Taiwan's numerous concessions and the retraction of most territorial claims on the Chinese mainland, Beijing still views Taiwan as a rogue province. This simmering conflict has all the makings of a Cold War showdown, with Taiwan standing firm as an independent nation in the eyes of most of the world. But now the tension is reaching boiling point. China has ramped up its military exercises around Taiwan with an aggressive frequency that's impossible to ignore. Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, set up by the US in the 1970s, requires foreign aircraft to announce their presence. While about 20 countries have these zones, they aren't legally binding, and China is taking full advantage of that. China's military drills routinely breach this boundary, flying dangerously close to the island. Taiwan sees these incursions as brazen acts of intimidation and a display of China's military might. Throughout the 2020s, these exercises within Taiwan's ADIZ have become disturbingly frequent, blatantly ignoring Taiwan's sovereignty. The stakes couldn't be higher. On May 23, 2024, the Chinese People's Liberation Army (PLA) staged its biggest military exercise near Taiwan yet. The Eastern Theater Command coordinated joint drills with the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Rocket Force, allegedly punishing Taiwan for its separatist actions over the years. But the real spark? The recent inauguration of President Lai Ching-te. So what actually happened during these drills? According to Taiwan's defense ministry, the drills involved 33 Chinese aircraft, 15 Navy ships, and 16 Coastal Guard vessels, making it the largest military exercise near Taiwanese soil in recent years. Taiwan viewed this as blatant saber-rattling, designed to undermine the tenuous peace that's developed over the decades. What's the endgame for China? Dubbed Joint Sword 2024A, the exercise hinted at more drills to come and raised the chilling possibility of a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, a scenario that could upend the current geopolitical climate. Stay with us as we dive deeper into these provocative maneuvers, uncover the strategic motivations behind them, and explore their dire implications for Taiwan and the broader region. Okay, let's start with some basic definitions. In case you didn't know, a blockade is also referred to as a quarantine. Now there's a word no one's been aching to hear since 2020. But what does it mean in practical terms? In the strictest sense, a quarantine uses law enforcement departments, such as the Coastal Guard that was part of the May military exercise, to limit or otherwise control maritime, sea-based, or airborne traffic to another state or territory. So how does this differ from a traditional blockade? A blockade typically requires a military deployment to the area. In China's case, they would probably try to issue a quarantine over Taiwan by deploying its Coastal Guard and police forces. The military would likely play a supportive role, such as strengthening China's force projection over Taiwan, thus ensuring that the quarantine sticks, so to speak. Why would China opt for a quarantine over a full blockade? Unlike the traditional meaning of a blockade, a quarantine wouldn't completely seal off Taiwan from the rest of the world. That would quickly backfire on China, as the US and its allies wouldn't take kindly to a complete blockade. Instead, a quarantine would allow China to enforce its own laws and control trade to and from Taiwan. Necessities like food, medicine, or other vital resources wouldn't be limited by Chinese law enforcement. However, Taiwan is one of the largest benefactors of tech and military equipment from the West. Consider this: the US sent $345 million worth of weapons to Taiwan in July 2023, and similar packages were forthcoming in previous years. Under a quarantine, China would most likely completely prevent future weapons shipments from ever reaching Taiwan. But this isn't China's first show of maritime strength. The military exercise in May wasn't the first time China displayed its maritime capabilities and potential for a quarantine or blockade of Taiwan. Remember when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, visited Taiwan in 2022? China deployed a patrol vessel directly off the coast of Taiwan. The same patrol vessel was called upon in 2023 during then-President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the US. According to Chinese officials, the Haijun 6, the vessel in question, was supposed to conduct routine inspections on passing vessels, although no such inspections appeared to occur throughout these exercises. This pattern is telling. China has a history of responding to international visits to Taiwan or Taiwanese representatives leaving the country by deploying various military and law enforcement strategies as a show of force. A similar law enforcement exercise took place during the May 2024 military exercise, where the Fujian Coast Guard deployed its vessels in waters in the median line between mainland China and Taiwan. According to the China Coast Guard, the CCG, this exercise was meant to establish a baseline for China's capabilities in quick response, reaction, and patrolling. The vessel approached around 3 miles from Taiwan's outlying islands of Wukyu and Dongyin, which was the first instance of Chinese vessels going so close to Taiwanese territory. What does this mean for Taiwan's future? It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to suggest that the law enforcement exercises was an attempt to ascertain China's options and reaction time when enforcing a quarantine or blockade on Taiwan. Due to a combination of military and law enforcement operations, it's clear that China isn't ready to stop ramping up its efforts to intimidate Taiwan and its allies. These events are a clear indicator that China has been truly considering making a strategic move to implement a quarantine around Taiwan. But how likely is it that China will make good on its threats? Let's go through some of the most notable benefits of blockading Taiwan. While implementing a blockade or a quarantine would be considered the biggest escalation in several decades, the move would arguably provide China with unprecedented control over the island. By quarantining Taiwan from the rest of the world, at least in regards to trade and movement of goods or people, China can impose its administrative and economic policies on the island. In a quarantine scenario, where the event wouldn't be considered a military conflict, China would effectively prevent Taipei from enforcing the territory's sovereignty. Controlling the maritime and airborne traffic to and from the island would effectively demonstrate to the world that Taipei can't control Taiwan. Only China can. A move which will erode the image that Taipei has been trying to build over the past 75 years. The ability of China to stop incoming trade ships for inspections doesn't stop at controlling what can enter or leave the island. It would add to the trading costs in Taiwan, which would eventually spiral out of control and lead to a potential economic crisis on the island. The goal in this scenario is relatively simple. By attacking Taiwan's economy, China would aim to destabilize the public's trust in the government and present a clear alternative where Taipei submits to Beijing's demands. Since a quarantine doesn't imply involvement from China's military, Beijing's actions to implement one wouldn't likely be seen as an overtly hostile act, to which Taiwan's allies would have to respond. Instead, the quarantine's limited scope would allow China to determine the exact level of control or screening that it would apply to the island. This would allow China to effectively gain significant ground in forcing Taiwan and the rest of the world to comply with its demands. If China were to successfully implement a limited quarantine without triggering a response from countries allied with Taiwan, particularly the US, and other members of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, it could set a new precedent for the normalized relations between China and Taiwan. This would allow Beijing to move slowly forward with its more comprehensive plans, while also giving Chinese law enforcement and military insight into potential risks and weaknesses of subsequent missions. As such, China would slowly start to build a stranglehold around Taiwan. Of course, China is trying to avoid having to deploy its military to the island directly. However, a successful implementation of a quarantine could possibly lead to China also enacting an actual blockade on the island. By that point, it's highly likely that Beijing would have enough economic measures in place to direct and influence the Taiwan economy. This would possibly escalate any military response from the US and its allies into a full-blown war that might destabilize the entire region. In the scenario where Taiwan essentially becomes dependent on China due to its skyrocketing trade costs, the territory would have few options at its disposal. Effectively, this would give China full control over the territory. From then on, China could pretty much enforce its claims over the island. Due to the nature of quarantine, it's highly unlikely that the US would respond with similar measures against China. Since the US presence in the South and East China Seas is primarily due to its navy, the country doesn't actually have that many coastal patrol vessels at its disposal. It's doubtful that the US would send military ships to perform the same duties as Chinese law enforcement and coastal guard patrol ships do, primarily since the perception of using the military vessels in a non-military activity would give China even more leverage. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, only about an eighth of US strategists were confident that the US would intervene militarily to prevent China from enacting a quarantine surrounding the island. Even in the event of an intervention, experts believe that US allies are unlikely to follow a multinational military conflict. Currently, China implementing a blockade would be a risky move, since it would involve military deployment by the PLA to Taiwan. If that were to happen, the US and its allies could respond by deploying their own forces. Therefore, a blockade of Taiwan would be the precursor to a war. However, enacting a quarantine alone avoids this scenario. The only aspect of the move that China has to consider is damaging relations with other countries in the process. If China enacts a quarantine on Taiwan, it's likely that some of its trading partners would renege on existing agreements and seek alternatives to pressure China to back off. However, the potential influence that China would gain from a quarantine around Taiwan would likely outweigh the downsides of losing some overseas trading partners. This is especially evident by the fact that China has bolstered trade with Russia and Central Asian countries, all of which are already economically dependent on China. But can China deploy enough patrol vessels and personnel to enact an effective quarantine over Taiwan? According to the last known fleet size of the CCG, it could be a feasible endeavor. The CCG has 150 ocean-going ships and 400 smaller ones, making it the biggest coastal guard fleet in the world. Additionally, the CCG is structured as a semi-militant organization, reporting directly to China's Central Military Commission. Beijing also frequently transfers its naval ships into coastal patrol ships, so some vessels are equipped with state-of-the-art military specs such as 76mm cannons. In contrast, Taiwan's Coast Guard has only 10 ocean-going and 160 other vessels. The island has around 300 ports, so Taiwan trying to protect its ports and match China's patrols while maintaining a presence in the open sea would be a tall order. Therefore, Taiwan would likely depend on the US fleet to artificially increase its fleet size, something that China would try to stop in the first place. Then there's the issue of China having a large militia force. These armed personnel are frequently on board commercial fishing vessels, posing as fishermen. In reality, the militia works closely with both the PLA and the CCG. Since the militia is technically neither a part of China's law enforcement or military, other countries don't have many options to respond to their actions internationally. Currently, the militia is estimated to contain 100 ocean-going and 3,000 smaller vessels. They are typically stationed in the South China Sea and are called upon to defend China's claims in the area, which overlap with every other country that borders the South China Sea. Finally, Taiwan's geography and economy make it particularly vulnerable to locking out trade via quarantine. While the island has hundreds of coastal settlements, there are only a handful of international ports. Of those ports, the port Kaohsiung was responsible for 57% of all Taiwanese trade, including most of the country's natural gas and oil. As such, a quarantine would only feasibly need to focus on blocking off a few vital ports in Taiwan. This would allow China to create overwhelming pressure on Taiwanese coastal patrols and create an effective choke point for trade. As a result of the aforementioned economic pressure, the import prices into Taiwan would skyrocket, effectively allowing Beijing to control how much Taiwan can trade. Even if China only feasibly manages to control Kaohsiung, it would still deal a significant blow to Taiwan's economy and international relations. Now that it's clear that China is likely to actually implement a quarantine or a blockade on Taiwan, how exactly would the situation pan out? There are a few possible scenarios. In the first, China would initiate a partial quarantine only. The main goal of the initial Grey Zone mission by China's law enforcement would be to wrest control of Taiwan's main trading ports. Even if China focuses only on a few of the largest ports, it would still be a significant win. Shortly before the actual operation, China would announce that it's moving its law enforcement units into waters currently governed by Taipei. Beijing would no doubt avoid language such as blockade or quarantine, since that would give China a bit more time before its actual goals could be recognized. Regardless, China would send at least 10 vessels near the port of Kaohsiung, since that could potentially be the main target of the first wave of quarantine, preventing all cargo ships from entering Taiwanese waters without reporting to relevant authorities in China for customs enforcement and declarations. Additionally, China could easily authorize its ships to board vessels and perform inspections at will, giving them unprecedented control over what goods can enter and leave Taiwan. China's main goal here will be to try and implement fines or other measures against ships that don't comply with boarding or inspection requests. China's vessels would likely be anchored between 12 and 24 nautical miles off the Taiwanese coast. Symbolically, this is important to both parties, since China has historically refused to accept Taiwan's territorial claims in the area. Also, most recent military exercises have entered this area without significant backlash by either the US or Taiwan, so China will no doubt try to exert even more pressure. These actions would ultimately be designed to create a new normal for Taiwan, where its trade is under tight control by Chinese authorities. Although Taipei is certain to object to these measures, the international community, specifically the US, has already been shown to have limited options when it comes to non-military initiatives. Although the quarantine would ostensibly appear to be a purely law enforcement operation, military support is still highly likely. China's Navy is predicted to dispatch 5 Surface Action Groups, SAGs, to surround Taiwan from a distance. Each SAG could consist of 3 to 6 ships, including destroyers, frigates, support vessels, and covertly deployed attack submarines, totaling nearly 30 warships. They would deter Taiwanese or other foreign Coast Guard ships or international military intervention and respond if Taiwan's navy escalates or attempts to escort ships to the island. They would also provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, allowing Beijing to monitor US, Japanese, or other movements. Alongside naval operations, the PLA might continuously fly manned and unmanned aircraft sorties around Taiwan to observe traffic, with the scale of the exercises increasing. In this scenario, Beijing doesn't even need full international compliance by companies trading in Taiwan. If around 75% of the shipping companies comply with Beijing's demands, that might be considered a significant victory for the limited quarantine. This would embolden China to move to the second scenario. Similar to the first scenario, China would announce new, enhanced customs inspection rules, mandating advance notice with Chinese authorities for shipping goods into Taiwan. However, the second scenario would involve enacting a complete quarantine over the entirety of Taiwan. This would mean that trade to all ports would be subjected to inspections and pressure from China's law enforcement and militia. China would likely appoint a quarter of the CCG to monitor all activity surrounding the island. This would be one of the biggest maritime operations in recent history by China, falling short of an actual naval invasion on the island. In the same way as before, the bulk of the inspections and actual trade pressure would be conducted by law enforcement and militia vessels. The military ships would provide vital recon. This time, China could supplement its naval deployment with its Shandong aircraft carrier and a strike group southeast of Taiwan. Next, it would launch frequent sorties of J-15 fighters east of Taiwan, repeating operations that the PLA has performed in recent years. While both types of quarantines would involve boarding and inspecting vessels, the second scenario entails much more input from Chinese authorities. This would increase China's reach into Taiwanese trade and economy and put a bigger stranglehold on the territory. As a result, the ports would experience significant delays in ship imports, and some companies are likely to cancel their shipping contracts to Taiwan, both of which would exacerbate the issue and plot the downfall of Taiwan's trade-based economy. Ultimately, both scenarios are designed to push the boundaries of what China can effectively do in Taiwanese waters without escalating its operations into a full-blown war or an invasion. While China currently possesses the strategic capability to implement these scenarios, many sources suggest that the most likely timeline for these events would start in 2027. This is likely to coincide with existing upgrades to China's Navy and Air Force, such as building more advanced fighter jets, just in case the strategy unfolds into a military conflict against Taiwan and, more importantly, the US. In any case, there's also a possibility that Taiwan manages to weather the storm of China's quarantine. If Taiwan's economy isn't set back sufficiently for Beijing to enforce more of its demands, China might be forced to move past a quarantine and into the realm of an actual blockade. In that scenario, China would allocate more of its military vessels to the task. This would ultimately prompt Taiwanese allies to respond in kind. While China is currently one of the biggest militaries in the world, with some sources suggesting it being in third place behind the US and Russia, the fact is that China's military technology is still decades behind the US. For example, China's air forces are no match for the US Air Force. The newest fighter jet that China has been developing, the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, is considered to have the same capabilities as the previous generation American equivalent, such as the F-15, which has been in service since the 1970s. Furthermore, the US has been developing newer generation aircraft of their own, which you can learn more about in some of our other videos. Additionally, the US Marine Corps is currently undergoing significant redesigns as part of the Force Design 2030 initiative. The redesign is meant to transform this part of the US Army into smaller, relatively independent littoral combat units. The Marines will utilize long-range artillery and contemporary reconnaissance technologies to provide vital support for the US Air Force and the Navy. Considering that the US has several vital military bases surrounding China, it could readily deploy the Marines on the islands in the South and East China Seas. This would create effective pressure points that would force China to reallocate some of its military vessels and other crucial equipment to stave off the US while simultaneously blockading Taiwan. It seems that we only have a few years left before China and the US decide whether to go to war. But what do you think? Is China going to continue its aggressive posturing against Taiwan and implement more offensive measures such as a quarantine or blockade? If so, will the US respond in kind? Let us know what you think in the comments.